What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review The Iron Claw, one of my most anticipated movies of the holiday season. It's the latest flick from A24, written and directed by Sean Durkin, and starring Zac Efron, Jeremy Allen White, Harris Dickinson, Maura Tierney, Holt McCallany, I never know how to say his name, and Lily James as the famous Von Erich family. And I must admit, I'm very new to the saga of the Von Erich family. I don't follow professional wrestling. I had a brief phase in the late 80s where I was into it, but I'm an MMA guy. I've been following MMA for the last 20 years, pretty hardcore, and there's some overlap between MMA and professional wrestling in terms of the fans and sometimes the talent, but not a ton of overlap. But for some reason, the moment I saw the trailer for this movie about a month or so ago, I was like, this looks cool as shit. I am so in. I want to know everything there is to know about the Von Erichs. And so I basically went on social media and said, hey, for all the wrestling fans out there, like, what documentaries, what footage should I watch? Like, what clips should I see in order to get up to speed? And as strange as it might sound to admit it, I think I had more fun doing the homework to get prepared for this review than actually seeing the movie itself. I liked the movie. I wasn't completely enthralled by the movie. I wasn't in love with the movie, but I really enjoyed it. But the homework that I did in preparation for it included the documentary Faded Glory, the Von Erich story from 1999. But the real showstopper was recommended to me by a fellow named Dick Deal, aka Dusty for Sight on Twitter, and the doc is called Heroes of World Class, The Story of the Von Erichs and the Rise and Fall of World Class Championship Wrestling. It is long as hell. It's from 2006, but I absolutely loved every single minute of it. And then I watched a highlight video called The Best of the Von Erichs, which is basically some of their most famous matches in their entirety from start to finish, including the legendary six-man tag team match between the Von Erichs and the Fabulous Freebirds back in August of 1983. And I fell in love with the Freebirds a long time ago when they popped up in the opening to the Highlander. In any event, the reason I'm divulging all this information is that I don't want to come across as a poser who's pretending to be some giant Von Erich fanatic when really all the information I have at my fingertips, I've basically known it for like the last couple days or a week at most. But let's get into the flick. But this review is going to be a little tricky when it comes to spoilers because there's a lot of tragedy and there's a lot of death and there's a lot of horrible shit that happens to this family over the course of this movie, and it's all based on actual real life and history. So it's not like a spoiler. It's not something that's being made up, but obviously it's going to be a surprise for people who are just going to the movie and want to walk in cold and just have a dramatic narrative experience. So I'm going to start with very broad general comments, and then I'll warn you before discussing anything too specific from the actual history of the Von Erich family. So let's just ease into things with the official synopsis from Wikipedia, which reads, the film is centered around the Von Erich family, a dynasty of professional wrestlers from Texas that had enormous success in the 1980s and popularized the Iron Claw professional wrestling hold. However, they not only had to battle inside the ring, but they also fought the Von Erich curse outside of it, a string of unbearable personal tragedies. And I think that basically captures the gist of it. However, I think the movie actually kind of taps the brakes because once you start watching some of the documentaries on this family and digging into the history, you see how the tragedies begin back in the 1950s with a freak accident due to electrocution in the snow, killing a 6-year-old boy. And they don't even include that in the movie. They acknowledge that the first Von Erich, that he did die, but he's not really a big part of the movie. But the tragedies, they just kept coming and coming up through the late 90s. And maybe they thought that this movie would just like drive people to suicide if they included all the tragedies and all the accidents and all the suicides. I mean, it's just unbelievable what this one family experienced. But the movie's told from the point of view of Kevin Von Erich, played by Zac Efron. And Kevin Von Erich is still alive today. He has a ton of kids, a ton of grandkids. He has a huge family. And when he's talking about his own life or looking back on his own life, he doesn't really feel like he was like the victim of a series of horrible tragedies because he says his family, they live lives of such intense, like concentrated experience. They almost kind of lived the lives of like 10 men before a lot of them met their untimely ends. And maybe that's just a way of kind of helping him get over the fact that he started out as a person with a lot of brothers and now he just stands alone. But once again, he's got a rich, full life with a giant family. But I was a little bewildered at times by some of the tragedies that the movie chose to omit. And I was also a little bewildered by the way it kind of plays fast and loose with the timeline. And I get it. When you're making a feature film, it's different from a documentary. You can't just tell it from beginning to end. But for people who are diehard fans of the Von Erichs, people who've been like following the Von Erichs since like the late 70s or hell, going back to the 50s, because all the Von Erich boys, their father was a wrestler as well. I mean, he's the one who coined the phrase. He came up with the Iron Claw. So I feel like there are probably some wrestling fans out there that have been following the Von Erich dynasty for like 70 years at this point. They'll probably be a little pissed by some of the liberties that are taken with the official timeline. But writer-director Sean Durkin, he was kind of in an impossible situation because there's so much footage and there's so much material and there's so much behind the scenes. I mean, these guys, they led very well-documented lives for many, many years. And like, what do you include? Do you include all the great like behind the scenes shenanigans with like all like the videos they're making taunting their adversaries? Do you include all the hell raising and the partying and the drinking and the drug abuse and the women and that sort of thing? Or do you really focus on the family and the relationship with the father, the original Von Erich? And I feel like no matter what creative decisions he ultimately decided to make, people were going to find ways to criticize him. I just feel a debt of gratitude to Sean Durkin because even if I disagree with some of the decisions that he made or some of the creative choices, I would not know anything about the Von Erichs if not for the fact that Sean Durkin made this movie. And according to this same article over on Wikipedia, Sean Durkin had been working on this passion project for a really long time, and he started doing research back in 2015. So as somebody who's only been following this saga for about a week, I feel a little weird kind of correcting him or telling him that he's wrong with his various creative decisions because in the end, the movie is very enjoyable. I guess enjoyable is the wrong word because it is very sad, or a big chunk of it is very sad. But I was definitely engaged, and I was getting off on a lot of the spectacle in the film because at a minimum, Zac Efron and Jeremy Allen White, they went all in on the physical fitness. I don't know what kind of program they ran in order to kind of learn the choreography and the moves and just get jacked up and swollen. And the reality is no actor is ever going to get as big and huge and crazy looking as Kerry Von Erich. I mean, Kerry Von Erich was a legitimate Olympic athlete, a total physical specimen. The only reason he didn't go to the Olympics was because Jimmy Carter decided to basically blackball the Olympics that year due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But he should have been a major track and field legend in the Olympics back in 1980. And I think Jeremy Allen White's probably a good foot shorter than the real deal, Kerry Von Erich, but obviously Jeremy Allen White has accumulated a lot of fans as of late. I mean, I used to watch him on that show Shameless. I've not watched The Bear yet, but I know that there are fanatics out there that absolutely love and adore season 1 and 2 of The Bear. I hope those fans of The Bear will also be encouraged to check out The Iron Claw, but in the end, this is Zac Efron's show, and he just goes all in. And I would never claim that I've been like some huge Zac Efron fan over the years. I've seen him pop up in movies here and there. There was that frat guy comedy that he did with what the hell is it? I gotta look it up real quick. Neighbors back in 2014. That's what I'm thinking of. And Zac Efron has always been very shredded and very fit. I remember watching an interview with him years ago about how he said in order to like maintain that level of like muscle to fat ratio, he basically had to live off a diet of grilled chicken and steamed vegetables, and he had to eat like 6 times a day in order to maintain that muscle mass. And he said his jaw got so sore from just chewing it. It's like, can you just put it in a blender so I can just get this stuff in my system? But like, he's no stranger to getting incredibly shredded for a particular movie, but goddamn, he packed on some bulk for this because Kevin Von Erich was an incredibly athletic guy. I mean, when you watch him in the original matches from the late 70s and early 80s, especially in tag team, like when someone tags him, he doesn't just go through the ropes. He'll like jump up in the air and do like a huge flying split. I mean, he was an incredibly athletic guy. Like they all were, but I feel like David, he probably had the best like physical presence and was probably the best on the mic. When you watch some of the shit talking that goes on between wrestlers, David was by far the most entertaining, and they tap into a little bit of that in the flick. David's played by Harris Dickinson, who a lot of people will recognize from movies like Triangle of Sadness and The King's Man. I thought he was great in Triangle of Sadness and The King's Man. Here, he kind of gets overshadowed by just so much that's going on. But for somebody who's not from Texas, I think he did the best that he could with the accent. And there's one scene where it really gets to kind of lean into David's classic persona. But if you go back and watch some of the old footage of David Von Erich, there was one bit of footage that I saw where he basically, like, one of his opponents lost a bet and he had to come work on his ranch for a couple days. And it was just absolutely hilarious watching David just abuse this guy, making him like pick up bales of hay and drag him around the yard and that sort of thing. But anyway, David was the real deal when it came to being a big, larger-than-life personality. But by far the biggest personality in this movie, and probably the role that was best cast, is that of Fritz Von Erich, played by Holt McCallany. And I guess I first discovered him through that show Mindhunter, where I thought he was absolutely fantastic. But he's incredible here. I mean, he is just an absolutely ruthless, tough love father where none of his children would have had any of the careers that they had if not for him. He basically just like conceived of this wrestling dynasty a long time ago, and he never quite got to the level that he wanted to reach as a performer and as an athlete. But now as a promoter, he basically is like the mastermind behind the Sportatorium in Dallas, where a couple times a week, they bring in the best wrestling talent they can find, people like Ric Flair, and more often than not, their opponents are the children of Fritz Von Erich. They're the feature attraction, and they just enjoy a true golden age from the late 70s up through about the mid 80s, where they're just kicking ass, taking names, generating great ratings, great ticket sales. And you'd have to ask a real wrestling historian to tell you the true story about where their promotion went wrong versus some of the other major promotions that started consolidating and merging. The only wrestling match that I ever saw was a WCW match, like in 97 or 98. They came through Charlottesville, Virginia when I was at the University of Virginia. I got to see Goldberg wrestle. I got to see Booker T. I got to see a few luminaries from that time. But obviously, the story of the wrestling or the wrestling world over the last couple of decades has been a story of consolidation. But if you were to point to one thing that this movie does well, it would be just the tyrannical rule of Fritz von Erich over the family. And periodically, Kevin, played by Zac Efron, he'll go to the mother, like, I think Dad's being a little too hard on Mike. Like, Mike's kind of a hippie, he likes guitar, he likes rock and roll. He's not really interested in wrestling. But that doesn't really matter to Fritz von Erich. As tragedies begin to befall the family and they start losing members, he basically tells Mike, whether you like it or not, you're following in the family tradition and you're going to become a wrestler too. And it would take a legit psychoanalyst or psychologist to try to figure out the degree to which Fritz von Erich and the manner in which he raised his boys, to what degree that played a role in all the tragedies that befell so many members of that family. And obviously, when you're dealing with suicide or suicidal behavior and violence, there are going to be a million different reasons as to why you might succumb to that level of depression. But in the end, I mean, they're all flying very close to the sun in terms of the success, the money, the drugs, the adulation. And I was watching an interview with Kevin Von Erich recently where he said he thinks the thing that saved him versus his brothers is that he had a family. The character of Kevin's wife, Pam, is played by Lily James, and I love and adore Lily James. She is a very talented actress and very easy on the eyes. She might have been a little wasted on this movie. I feel like she was totally game and she was ready to do like whatever was asked of her for this movie. Perhaps her part was a little underwritten, but I get it. This is a story of the Von Erichs. It's a story of the Iron Claw. It's a story of these fellas. And so maybe they were asking Lily James to kind of like do too much heavy lifting with an underwritten role, but I always enjoy seeing Lily James in her part. But apparently in real life, Kevin's family dynamic with his wife and with his kids, that's one of the things that kind of grounded him while his brothers were kind of spinning out of control. And there are moments in this movie where I feel like fans of this story, they will feel true moments of exhilaration, especially around like 1983 when you've got Carrie and David and Kevin all in their prime, wrestling side by side, doing a simultaneous drop kicks. I mean, all that stuff's handled really well. And you got all that kick-ass music by Rush blasting in the background. It's cool. I mean, it's wrestling in a weird way. It's a mix of like rock and roll and porn and combat sports. I've heard a lot of people describe combat sports as kind of the red light district of professional sports. But if you're going to take that analogy a little further, wrestling is the red light district of combat sports. But for my own personal taste, and this is one of my big criticisms of the movie, I kind of wish they'd gone a little further with like the excess and like the over-the-top behavior. Like they should have gone like full Boogie Nights, full porn star, full rock star. Like when you watch some of the footage of Kerry Von Erich walking into the arena, I mean, girls would just like attack him and start making out with him then and there, and he would make out with them back and that sort of thing. Like there was a sleaze factor that I think this movie deliberately kind of shied away from. It wanted to focus on the family dynamics. It wanted to focus on the relationship with the father, and I get it. But you can't leave out the sizzle when you're cooking a steak. You got to give, the kind of those visceral ingredients before you start getting into all the horrible personal tragedy that this family endured over many, many years. And even though I enjoyed the movie, I kept feeling like this movie was kind of permanently stuck in second gear or tapping the brakes. It just wasn't really like unleashing the Kraken and going totally crazy the way that I wanted it to. And who knows, maybe Sean Durkin didn't want to tell a story in that style or that fashion. More power to him. Like I said, I wouldn't even know about these guys if not for Sean Durkin. So I don't want to criticize him too heavily, but maybe I can't really go much further without divulging some spoilers that actually, they're not even spoilers, it's historical fact, but some of the events that befell these characters. So if you want to go into this movie totally cold, knowing nothing, bail out now. But I do want to talk about a few spoilers and some of the things that were changed and the things that were left out for the purposes of this movie. So my biggest complaint about this movie is how the story of Kerry Von Erich was kind of manipulated and changed for dramatic effect, but without actually achieving any major dramatic effect. I feel like if you're going to take poetic license and make some major changes to something that's a matter of historical record, well, then you better deliver the goods when it comes to searing emotional drama. But in the context of the movie, after Kerry wins the title from Ric Flair, they basically showed that as he's celebrating and kind of can't come down from the high, he's been boozing for a while, he decides to go on a motorcycle ride, and then you flash forward to where his foot's been removed. And they don't quite tell you at what point like the foot's gone, but he's still all covered up in scrapes and that sort of thing. And it's basically implying that he lost his foot then and there back in 1983 when he wrestled Ric Flair, when the reality was he didn't lose his foot until a few years later. And I just felt like it was an unnecessary dramatic change that didn't really deliver any sort of like major colossal scene, so why make the change at all? But the strangest creative choice was leaving Chris Von Erich out of the story entirely. And I get it, it's like how much tragedy and how much suffering can the audience endure? But he was one of the Von Erichs. He was one of the brothers, and his story is much more sad, and he ended up shooting himself in the head at age 21. For people who don't know, Chris Von Erich, he had some growth issues due to some, I think it was asthma medicine he was taking. I'm not quite sure, but his growth was stunted, and so he looked like a perpetual little boy next to his brothers, and obviously he was never going to have a big wrestling career if he wasn't, a huge giant beast of a man like some of his brothers. And it's horrible what happened to him, but there are times in the ring where you see Mike and Chris doing their thing, and none of like their more famous brothers are in the ring, but like leaving him out of the story entirely, I just feel like if I were one of the Von Erichs, I'd be worried that Chris Von Erich is kind of rolling in his grave, like, what the fuck? Like, we finally got a movie made about our family, and you're not even going to put me in it? They could have easily included him and just have him be in a smaller role, but I thought it was really strange leaving him out. And then when it comes to the relationship with the father, for whatever reason, the movie just leaves out giant chunks of his story. Like after losing so many sons to suicide and depression and accidents and just strange occurrences, like I'm still not entirely sure how David Von Erich died. Some people say that he was on drugs, and that was one of the reasons why he had like a burst intestinal wall or something like that. But he died under mysterious circumstances in his hotel over in Japan. But like after the death of so many children, as a result, the father, Fritz, ended up getting divorced from his wife, and then the father ended up dying of cancer a few years later. But prior to that, he and Kevin had some horrible confrontations, which Kevin has alluded to, and how there was a time where the father, Fritz, was holding the gun that Kerry used to kill himself, and he was pointing it at Kevin and saying, like, you don't have the courage or you don't have the balls to kill yourself the way your brothers did, because I guess he had 3 brothers commit suicide. But you want to talk about a big dramatic scene that could have easily been the climax to the movie. I mean, I'm sure Zac Efron and Holt McCallany would have been totally game and totally up for the challenge of trying to capture that scene, but maybe they just thought it was too dark and too savage. I don't quite know. Or maybe Kevin, who's still alive, maybe he didn't want that story included, but he's talked about it quite a few times in interviews, so I'm just not quite sure why the movie would remove a scene that could have been the climax of the film, because right now the movie just kind of fades and dissolves into nothing. And there was some applause at the end, and some people were really into it, but I just felt like the movie could have really gone for it with like a big climax to like leave the audience totally devastated on their way out of the theater. And I just feel like there are too many situations where the movie just didn't quite go for it, felt like it was tapping the brakes. So I was slightly disappointed. I enjoyed the movie, but as you've seen in my thumbnail, I was really excited ahead of time. Got this stupid mask out, took my shirt off, but I felt a little bit like somebody who's like dressed up as Darth Vader to go see the latest Star Wars movie, only to realize that like the latest Star Wars movie, I wouldn't say, this is a bad comparison, but like if you go see a Star Wars movie and you're dressed as Darth Vader, you're hoping for the best possible Star Wars movie possible, but these days most likely the Star Wars movie that you would see would probably suck. The Iron Claw definitely does not suck. I'd say the Iron Claw is good, but if your idea of like a great A24 movie is something like Uncut Gems, which came out in December of 2019, it was like one of like the big, crazy, kick-ass specialty films of the holiday season in 2019, the Iron Claw, in my opinion, doesn't come anywhere close to the emotional impact of a movie like Uncut Gems. But I'm glad that I saw it, and I'm thrilled that Sean Durkin basically exposed me to this fascinating story. But for anybody out there who's looking for like the real, visceral, crazy, intense drama, and admittedly, this is coming from somebody who does not follow professional wrestling, but as I said before at the beginning of my video, check out the many documentaries out there. You will absolutely be blown away. So I'm sure there's a lot more stuff out there, a lot more footage, a lot more interviews that the diehard fans could point me to, but I feel like that was a great primer, a great way to kind of get started, a great way to get immersed in this world, just so you know how cool it is when you see the fabulous Freebirds going up against the Von Erichs and what that rivalry meant. Like, it was a rivalry in the South between Georgia and Texas, or as Kevin Von Erich said in real life, this is not about like a Southern rivalry. It's about decency versus filth. And for some reason, that line goes to David Von Erich in the movie. I don't know why, but like I said before, this movie takes a lot of liberties, but it's totally worth seeing. And I hope it'll find an audience because I like seeing cool, like original programming that is not based on these giant franchises like fucking Aquaman or whatever the case might be. Like the world of movies needs many more dramas like this. So whether it's MMA or boxing or wrestling or kickboxing or jiu-jitsu, I will always show up for a cool movie about combat sports. While MMA is my bread and butter, I'm open to all of them in a cinematic context. But I think I've ranted and raved enough at this point, so I hope you enjoyed this review. If you are a diehard wrestling fan, I look forward to your comments down below and let me know what I got wrong or what I overlooked or other hidden chapters in wrestling history that I might find equally compelling and interesting. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. But I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend at the movies, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.